first speaker is Amanda Noconi, and she's the host of Silly Rabbits podcast, an interdisciplinary psychedelic researcher, eco-philosopher, and religious studies scholar. Amanda is from the Pacific Northwest and is also the director of the Central Oregon Psychedelic Society, or COPS, which focuses on multidisciplinary research, education, harm reduction, policy reform, and building community in the Corvallis and Eugene, Oregon areas. So please welcome Amanda.
Thank you for having me here today. This talk I like to formally call Entheogens and the Eucharist, Altered States and the Origin of Sacrament. Each of these sections should probably, and someday I may, make them each their own presentation, but we don't have that going on today. So please bear with me while we breeze through approximately 35,000 years of history. People protect what they love. They love what they understand, and they understand what they are taught. Jacques Cousteau said this. And this quote forever changed my life and how I approach my everyday interactions with people and just things. I started to realize the ways in which I had been programmed through somebody else's love of something and what they thought I should be taught for whatever reason. And that's when I went from advanced chemistry and ecology into philosophy and religious studies. So it had a bit of an impact on me. And rite, ritual, and the arts are all traditions that have survived time because somebody decided that these things merited being taught to their friends, their families, their loved ones, their children, things that they wanted to survive the test of time. And traditions that were taught often represent an action that was performed, or the iconography depicting a theophany, or when a mystical being or deity presents itself visually to a human. Well, presumably. I assume that it was humans that answered this kind of study. So, entheogens are just one way to access these altered states of theophany. And they are chemical substances that are typically of plant and mycological origin and are administered to produce a non-ordinary or altered state of being. They are usually used for religious, spiritual, or initiatory purposes as a vehicle for or a supplemental aid to reaching this state of religious ecstasy, a moment of divine gnosis, or just theophany. Richard Schultz, Hoffman, and Rach said this much in their book, Plant of the Gods. And far from being consumed for hedonistic purposes, drugs, plants, and alcoholic drinks have had a sacred role in and among prehistoric societies, as you very well documented. I really can't wait to watch that. It was beautiful. Yeah, I'm getting distracted just thinking about the beautiful imagery. So it's not surprising that most of the evidence that we have derives from both elite burials and restricted ceremonial sites, suggesting the possibility that the consumption of mind-altering products was socially controlled in prehistoric Europe, even. And this is from the Origins of Inebriation, and archaeological evidence of the consumption of fermented beverages and drugs in prehistoric Eurasia. Next slide, please. Alex Gray's The Stoned Ape. Many of you have heard the stoned ape hypothesis or variations of it. And this wonderful painting is by visionary artist. Here, I'm just going to stand over here because I think the light's tilted a little bit. Sorry about that. That visionary artist, Alex Gray, painted this. The stoned ape that was inspired by Terence McKenna's and Dennis McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis, not theory. Right? In his book, Food of the Gods, Terence McKenna postulated that the transformation from humans' early ancestors, Homo erectus, to the species Homo sapiens was attributed to the addition of hallucinogenic mushrooms, specifically psilocybin kibinzi, into humanoid diet, or humanid diet. An event that, according to McKenna, took place about 100,000 BCE. And this is all in Food of the Gods. He also put forward that our ancestors' subsequent development and sophistication of language, art, music, tools, and just our increase in cognitive ability and function, also our society and religion, were all owed to the regular use and consumption of psilocybin kibinzis. Now, McKenna has been highly criticized for his lack of paleontological evidence and citation and his possible misinterpretation of the psilocybin and anthropological research available at the time. I strongly agree that these things are absolutely incorrect and absolutely need to have more investigation done in them. I feel that there are some serious holes in his presentation of this hypothesis, and that, and especially with his proposed timeline and the overemphasis of the role played by just mushrooms and also just psilocybin kibinzi varieties in particular. That being said, while it may be currently outdated and in serious need of a makeover, this hypothesis certainly merits more investigation and discussion from an interdisciplinary academic group. So, which brings me to a recent study that came out. I think it was like the 21st or 22nd of February this year, out of George Washington University. A study came out where they examined the potential cause for the increase of size in the brains from the early hominins to current Homo sapiens. Andrew Dew, PhD, said in his press release that, quote, brain size is one of the most obvious traits that makes us human. It's related to the cultural complexity, language, tool making, and all these other things that make us unique. Brain size, not function. The earliest hominins had brain sizes like chimpanzees, and they have increased dramatically since then, gradually over time, end quote. His advisor, Bernard Wood, PhD, was quick to add that, quote, no clear link between brain size, there was no clear link between brain size and behavior, meaning that the increase in brain size was in fact not due to certain chosen behaviors that our ancestors may or may not have engaged in. Now, this is just referring to the size of the brain, not necessarily the connectivity or how things are functioning in there. So, but this study just reinforces my beliefs that further interdisciplinary investigation into the stoned ape hypothesis might really help us quickly uncover a more comprehensive understanding of not only the human mind-body connection, but how our consciousness functions in general. Next slide, please. It's odd not being in control of that. This is a picture of the cave paintings at Selva Pascuala. That should be an E right there. And they date back to approximately 4000 BCE, and archaeological evidence suggests that psychoactive fungi or plants have been used by humans since the Paleolithic era, and a number of cave paintings have been discovered depicting therianthropic humanoids and often in ecstatic dreamlike states, and it's been hypothesized by some that these paintings were created while under the influence of hallucinogenic compounds. And they've been found all over the world, some dating back approximately 30,000 years or more. And this image depicts an auroch, our current day cattle's ancestor, and 13 mushrooms down here. And this has been dated, like I said, approximately 4000 BCE. The choice of an auroch subject for this kind of high art is something that we see over and over again. And this prominent cattle veneration that also emerged among African herders, which then spread to the Indo-Aryan societies, as discussed by Wasson and others. And this should strongly be analyzed here, as it's often overlooked, cattle veneration, as psilocybes are, I just read two sentences at once, one half at a time. Anyway, this needs to not be overlooked because psilocybes are a dung-loving variety of psychoactive mushrooms. They grow through the dung, and so psilocybe cabenses do that, and it's just a little coincidental that we find cave paintings with mushrooms often next to a creature who has dung that these particular type of mushrooms like. All right. This cattle veneration is also apparent in prehistoric India, Greece, Spain, France, North, South America, and other places. So pretty much globally, this is not an isolated phenomena. People have been trying to alter their state of consciousness since time immemorial. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a better close-up picture of the Selva Pascuala mushrooms. And Brian Akers of the Pasco Hernando Community College in Florida and Gaston Guzman at the Ecological Institute of Jalapa in Mexico say that they believe that these objects are Psilocybe hispanica, a local variety of hallucinogenic mushrooms. They're commonly found among the same depictions of cattle veneration, and along with these depictions are often humanoids, as I had said earlier, and anthropomorphized shaman of sorts. The therianthropic imagery in these paintings is commonly reported in visionary experiences even to date. And it happens cross-culturally among many of those who use hallucinogenic materials of various kinds. Now, the priest, shaman, or spiritual leader of the community was often believed to have the power to transform into a chosen animal or form, either partially or completely. And this imagery or symbolism can clearly be traced to prehistoric periods and has survived into modernity, not just reemerged, into modernity among tribal communities in China, Africa, Siberia, as well as North, Central, and South America. Next slide, please. Here is one of these therianthropic beings at the Tassili caves. This cave painting's pretty familiar. I mean, everybody here seen the bee shaman, I assume. Well, a series of paintings found in the Tassili Plateau in northern Algeria, dating somewhere between 5000 and 7000 BCE, depict several humanoids with mushroom-shaped heads and protrusions. And one particular in painting, the bee shaman, is covered in obvious mushroom protrusions. And it's earned a great deal of scholarly attention for quite a few reasons. And so far, this representation remains one of the oldest and virtually undeniable depictions of hallucinogenic mushrooms that we have to date. Now, the bee and the mushroom combinations is not an accident here. It's not just a mere whim of artistic expression. The artist was not just having fun with this painting. Well, maybe they were, but this was meant to tell a story. In a period long before mechanized refrigeration. So early man quickly discovered ways to keep seemingly miraculous things preserved in honey. Honey was this miraculous medicine preservation tool, and it went hand in hand with this miraculous and quick-lived hallucinogenic compound. Being that mushrooms are only available for a short period of time each year and are highly seasonal, placing dried mushrooms in honey is not only a way to increase the shelf life dramatically, but also to make mushrooms more palatable. I don't know how many of you here tried to eat a fistful of hallucinogenic mushrooms, but it can get rough. A little bit of honey might help that medicine go down a little better in the most delightful way, right? And so it really makes sense that these images were combined together in such a way at that time to help pass on the knowledge that they wanted to keep around for people, for next generations, of how to preserve these things and be able to access them at will, not just seasonally. And you can find more details on that in Food of the Gods as well, because they do go into the bee shaman quite a bit. Next slide, please. Now we're in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The magical and medical communities of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt relied heavily on a well-established pharmacopoeia. And they were very concerned with the production of quality beers and wines using a variety of psychotropic, psychoactive, medicinal herbs in the process, because wine was not just wine until fairly recently. I imagine you're going to talk about that at all?
All you.
Oh, really?
Take it away.
Oh, man, that's the next one. Okay. Brews were, by and large, amended with psychoactive herbs and medicinal herbs and such for a long time. And then I can't remember the year, the 1500s, there was the pure beer. 1562?
1560.
Oh, 1516. The Bavarian
Bavarian
Beer
Army?
Act. Yeah. Yes. Which limited the amendments, or made it so that there were requirements for beers and wines that they could only have a certain, or they could only have the base ingredients to them and not these medicinal amendments. So it kept it to the grains and water and yeast, and that's it. So they took the fun out of beer. Now we see motifs of Sumerian cultivation of opium poppies and barley for these medicated beers and drinks, and we see them as early as 3400 BCE. Images of plants like the blue water lily and cannabis and datura are frequently depicted as being held or cultivated by deities, demigods, or the priest class, as seen here. This strongly affirms the social mindset of the times regarding psychoactive or psychotropic plant materials and their connections to divinity or the other world. Because all we see with these plants and compounds are their interpretation as vehicles being driven by those who have the wherewithal to guide in those realms. Now, from analyzing residue found in ancient brewery containers, researchers have uncovered evidence of medicated beers and wines that use such psychotropic admixtures as mandrake, datura, blue water lily, cannabis, opium, ephedra, and calamu. By examining the art, hymns, and poetry of ancient Mesopotamian Egypt, it becomes clear very quickly that plant medicines were viewed as either a vehicle to divinity or just as the embodiment of divinity itself. And to imbibe in these and to become inebriated with the spirit was to temporarily be possessed by that spirit held within that plant. Next slide, please. Dan Merker and the Mystery of Manna. Now, Dan Merker is a former professor at Syracuse University and Auburn Theological Seminary professor. And he postulates in his book, The Mystery of Manna, that the Hebrew tribes, under the direct orders of Moses, were both familiar with and, in fact, utilized the secrets of ergot alkaloids. And ergot alkaloids are those from which LSD and psychoactive relatives are derived. Ergot is a fungal variety that infects some types of grains and grasses, as well as barley and wheat. You can find that with Jonathan Ott's book, Pharmacopoeia. Now, Dan Merker suggests that the descriptions of manna and the later showbread of presence, the showbread or bread of presence that replaced manna's position in the tabernacle are clear references to hallucinogenic material. By repeatedly referring to the ingestion of a holy or sacred material that was then followed by a reliable and often promised experience of theophany, these early Hebrews were describing what we today would call a psychedelic or hallucinogenic compound leading to an experience. Ergot infestations are easily identified. As you can see here that there's something going on that grain. While not addressed in Merker's work directly, it stands to reason that as the alleged slave class, the Hebrews, I have to say alleged, it's just a technicality, but the Hebrews would have had access to the processes of working the grains in the field, threshing out the grains, and threshing out harvests, then running the bakeries and brewing things, then supplying the rest of Egypt with the staple commodities provided in that process. Now, this series, the series of plagues that terrorized the Egyptians after Pharaoh's refusal to free the Jewish peoples can all be interpreted as prolonged ergot poisoning. Given the fact that there's never been a shred of archaeological evidence found to substantiate some of the plague events, boils, fire from the sky, etc., toads, that type of thing. It does sound like a lot of hallucinations rather than just the wrath of Yahweh. Now, we do know that there are some scientifically supported reasons for some of those events, like algal blooms that could change rivers red, environmental factors that other environmental factors that could cause rivers to run red as well, or locals and their migratory patterns and, say, 7-year cycles, because a lot of cicadas and locusts have 7 to 11-year migratory cycles. So I'm not talking about those plagues, but some of the others that seem a little trippy. Now, the final plague, the death of the firstborn of Egypt, it's eerily analogous to the late-stage symptoms of prolonged ergot poisoning. The symptoms of ergot poisoning include, and they are absolutely devastating to the body and mind, but they include intense alternating feelings of heat and cold, the develop of gangrene, sometimes resulting in loss of limb, delirious hallucinations, and severe gastric disturbances, usually ending in death. Now, the mark across the threshold that spared the angel of death from entering the Jewish homes would also alert those who worked at the breweries or the bakers. They would alert them of which homes to deliver the edible or safe goods to. The Hebrew community in Egypt would have certainly had the means, method, wherewithal, and motive to administer a truly biblical onslaught onto Pharaoh and his people for their direct oppression and murderous ways. Yep. I know, it's such a hard, great spot to get stuck at. Now, immediately after the death of the Egyptian firstborn, Moses parts the Red Sea. Miriam, won't get into that. Men always taking women's work. No, I'm kidding. So, but after parting the Red Sea, he leads the Israelites out of Egypt, presumably while the Egyptians are still mourning their dead and potentially strung out for Yahweh knows how long from ergot exposure. And they certainly had enough time to gather the herd animals and a good portion of loot as well before they left. Again, this is just based on my interpretation of correlations that I noticed while comparing evidence from historical, anthropological, ethnobotanical, and biological implications of the works used in this research that were mixed with what I read in Mystery of Manna. And I do hope to see more research done on this topic, and I really would like to see more rabbinical scholars overtly talking about it, not writing around it, because I can guarantee that if this shiksa saw this and put this together, that people who have trained their entire lives to recognize all of the history of their people would be able to tell me better whether or not that works. So I really hope that more rabbinical scholars not only look into it, but if they do, please say something, because we can't investigate it if people do not put it out there in the first place or are too afraid to look into it. All right, and that does not conclude our portion on biblical bioterrorism. Next slide, please. Sorry. Now, this is just a beautiful image of Moses in the burning bush. But Benny Shannon is a retired professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he presented a paper in 2008 called Biblical Entheogens, a Speculative Hypothesis, which he uses ayahuasca analogs, that is, he parallels the effects induced by the psychedelic brew ayahuasca with biblical accounts of the life of Moses. Right? And he says, quote, "Admittedly, the smoking gun is not available to us. However, so many clues present themselves which, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, seem to cohere into an intriguing, unified whole. I leave it to the reader to pass his or her judgment. Now, I believe that we are all here because we agree with that and we want to learn a little bit more about it. Now, expanding on this hypothesis, it seems like less of a stretch that when one takes into account that as an adopted member of the royal family, Moses would have been inducted into ceremonies and higher orders of learning by the Egyptian priest class. As such, he would have been well familiar with the use of medicated alcohols and beers, not to mention plants like blue water lily, blue lotus, calamu, opium, cannabis, datura, mandrake, etc. These things were well documented at his time. And when Moses later fled across the Red Sea after killing an Egyptian slave master, he arrived in Midian with what we can only assume was, at the very least, a cursory understanding of the medicinal, intoxicating, and potentially entheogenic effects of plants and fungi. Now, Shannon goes on in his 2008 paper saying that the hypothesis is based on a new look at texts of the Old Testament pertaining to the life of Moses. The ideas entertained were primarily based on the fact that the arid areas of the Sinai Peninsula in southern Israel are where there grow two plants containing the same psychoactive molecules found in the plants from which the powerful Amazonian hallucinogenic brew ayahuasca is prepared. The two plants are species of acacia tree and the bush Pegamin harmala. The hypothesis is correlated by comparative experiential phenomenological observations, linguistic considerations, exogenous of old Jewish texts and other Mideastern traditions, anthropological lore, and ethnobotanical data. End quote. And that's from Benny Shannon's Biblical Entheogens. Now, Shannon is suggesting that it is the acacia and Syrian rue endemic to the areas that can be combined to create a DMT-MAOI mixture or an effective ayahuasca analog. Shannon, along with many other rabbinical scholars, have identified the burning bush to be a species of acacia that is high in the psychoactive component DMT. There are many species of acacia which contain exceptionally high amounts of DMT in their root bark and aerial extremities, and they are common in the Sinai region at the time, or they were common in the Sinai region at the time. Now, Pegamin harmala, commonly known as Syrian rue, contains a necessary MAO inhibitor that would make the DMT in the acacia orally active. A simple tea extraction of the two plants would suffice to create a very potent ayahuasca analog. And one could theoretically say that maybe they could, one could theoretically burn the bush after drinking the MAOI and also elicit the same response. Now, ayahuasca analogs are prevalent as the components are readily found in nature, and it's not far-fetched to reason that one would find any way to alter their state of consciousness. I mean, we've all known somebody who experiments with altering their states with things that we wouldn't necessarily have heard of, like nutmeg, for example, that kind of thing. And often altering one's consciousness also often alters their ability to control their basic motor functions, which brings me to the next slide. Oh, that noise. There you go. Now, they're helping Moses down off of the mountain here. Doesn't necessarily look like he's got it all together. I mean, just look at this guy. Come on. We've all known that guy. You know, he calls you at 3 a.m., give me a ride home, the bar closed.
Some of us
Yes.
did that.
Right? So, this is Moses in Revelation. That's the name of this painting, Moses in Revelation. Now, does he look like he's in Revelation? I mean, we were all just joking about him looking like he was inebriated, so maybe there's something there. And even the earliest texts maintain a degree of pretense concerning psychoactive substances, but I hesitate to consider them esoteric. The transparency of the depictions indicates a sort of open secret, that's widely attested anthropologically, and that is shared by many societies' adults, but not necessarily young children, for example. Ancient oral traditions that were always addressed simultaneously to children and adults asserted with the manna. What is it? Was it eaten in the wilderness? Now, the transparent riddle was presumably intended to avoid encouraging children to experiment with ergot on their own. Now, through failure in educating adults, the deception that was later extended to them as well, what had anciently been intended as metaphor and symbolic allusions were unwittingly refined as miraculous violations of nature. And that's through McCur's sentiments in The Mystery of Manna. Next slide, please. Now the fun stuff. Now, the Eleusinian mysteries, Dionysus and Demeter and Persephone. The philosophical and religious mecca of the ancient Greek world was undoubtedly the Eleusinian mysteries. The mysteries were an annually held initiation ceremony for the cult of Demeter and Persephone, which was based at Eleusis. Starting in approximately 1500 BCE, the Eleusinian mysteries consistently administered visionary gnosis for the masses for nearly 2 millennia. 2,000 years these mysteries were running. And the ceremony was available to all classes of society, and nearly every major mover and shaker of ancient Greece attended, provided they could pay the fee, which was a pig, I think. Yeah. It was, yeah, pig. Everybody brings a little bit, like potluck style, cookout style, you know, pig luck style. Exactly. But initiates could attend the ceremony only once in a lifetime and were sworn to secrecy thereafter. Proclus, I misspelled that, described the events in the following, quote, "They cause the sympathy of the souls with the ritual in a way that is incomprehensible to us and divine, so that some of the initiates are stricken with panic, being filled with divine awe. Others assimilate themselves to holy symbols, leaving their own identity, becoming at home with the gods, and experience divine possession," end quote. Now, it's all well-established it's a well-established theory that the kykeon, which participants drank from before experiencing their visionary revelations, contained some kind of psychoactive elixir, most likely another form of ergotized beer. Sorry, I'm getting a little parched. Now, Wasson, Hoffman, Ruck, and Houston Smith all say this in The Road to Eleusis, unveiling the secret of the mysteries. Now, to the early Greek, Dionysus himself was the embodiment of inebriation. And so to be inebriated by such a plant god was to be overcome by the divine. Dionysus himself. Next slide, please. Now, the Maenads and Bacchantes, and the Thyrsos. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, awesome. That would be great. I'm trying not to. Yeah, we didn't think ahead and bring water. Now, the female attendants or devotees of Dionysus were the Maenads or Bacchantes, and often acted as hierophants and assistants during the mystery ceremonies held at Eleusis. Every year, during a specific time in the season, the Bacchantes would roam the countryside collecting medicinal herbs with a ceremonial staff that was a hollowed out fennel stalk, which was crowned with a symbolic pine cone. This is called the Thyrsos. You often see them on philosophy buildings at universities. A lot of the time they'll have archways that have Thyrsos, like pine cones and stuff on them, which is just kind of fun. After working on this instead of mycovision, I got Thyrsos vision and started seeing them all over the place. Usually if you work with like anything Wasson Ruck related, it's mycovision, right? Anyway. Now Dionysus could, went forward. According to the myth, the women would then, after collecting all of these medicinal herbs, would rave about the countryside for some time in an ecstatic state, so much so that they were said to murder passers-by and even eat their own babies. Now this slanderous reputation held tightly to the Bacchantes until Carl Ruck, a Greek classicist at Boston University, helped to reinterpret the precise role of these women. And it elevated this group from a cult of ecstatic lunatic baby murderers to intelligent, capable goddess worshippers and those who revered life. Now, I wasn't necessarily going to go into this, but I am going to take a minute because it is really important to the story. But the reason for the mysteries, which happened twice a year, not just once a year, they were seasonally, and the seasons do coincide with fall and spring mushroom season. However, they also coincide with just fall and spring. Now, the whole story of Demeter and Persephone is incredibly sad, and the entire reason for the season of winter is basically because Demeter's daughter was essentially tricked into living in the underworld. And so a deal was made, and Demeter, who controls the crops and everything, said that if she didn't get her daughter back, she was going to just kill off the planet and let this die. So anyway, deals were made. She was able to get her daughter back for part of the year, which was the spring. And then when the fall came around, Persephone had to go back and be this, slave wife in the underworld. Now, that's why we have winter, because Demeter is pissed, quite frankly. Now, I just wanted to get that out here because I really think that it does a lot for women's studies to have Ruck and them reevaluate this, because the whole story is based on an age-old tale of female oppression through trickery, sorcery, enslavement, just like all around pretty shitty to these, I'm sorry to curse so much, so much, but, and then it is not just some weak women in the story, but this is happening to the most divine of goddesses that give us life itself, provide us with that which nourishes us as beings on this planet. And it's written off in the tale. It is absolutely not a very good feminist story, because the women do not win. They really do just make a better compromise and go back and do that. And Demeter is the only one who will not budge. That's the reason we still have winter. So Demeter is a great face for feminism, I guess. Or just the feminine, if you will. And the fact that these women were further demonized for centuries after the original story came out just reinforces the, patriarchal societies of the regions and how that bled in to, the 20th century, because it was Ruck, who's still alive, this dude who's still around, that just 50-something years ago reimagined that. All right, now, Dionysus could possess his ecstatic brides through the agency of other plants as well. Possess, mind you. For he was the vegetative consort residing in all manner of inebriants, including, apparently, fungi. Thus, the female devotees of the god Dionysus appropriately bore the Thyrsos as their emblem. As they roamed around the winter mountainsides in search of their so-called vine that grew suddenly with earth-rendering thunder and the bellows of bulls amidst their night-long dancing, that beloved child, the age-old serpent consort, was the object of their hunt, who was suckled, then like a beast torn into pieces and eaten raw. His own mothers, as was often claimed, were guilty of the cannibalism of his flesh. For like mothers, the women would have brought the drug into being, mushrooms, harvested and compounded it with the help of their god's so-called nurses, as God's so-called nurses, in whose loving care he, the god as mushroom, could grow into manhood, eventually be possessed, ripped apart, and cannibalized. So that's just one interpretation. Oh, and then I put why it's so important to women's studies at the end, but I ranted about that earlier. So next slide, please. I think I've got minutes. I was worried about cutting those out. Secret drugs in Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, this one is going to be quick and it's really fun. So, right here we have Buddha and on the Nagas, talking to the snake gods, getting information. And so, let's go with Shiva and Bong. Bong, everybody's heard of a bong. And that comes from bong, B-H-A-N-G, bong, yeah. And bong is a cannabis drink. Bang lassi, I'm sure everybody has mango lassi, right? Like that, right? Bang lassi is the cannabis drink. It is a Shaivite drink. It is a ceremonial, I guess they drink it like this all the time. But Shivites are very, very big into cannabis because cannabis is one of Shiva's medicine. It helps him maintain his calm, meditative state up on that mountain to avoid opening his eyes and destroying everything. So we want to keep cannabis in that. But the fact of the matter is, Hinduism is a pretty old belief structure, and the destroyer, where in their Trimurti they have, like, Shiva's one of the three that make the cycle of this incarnation happen in this dream. And his whole thing is cannabis veneration, pretty much. Now, there's also evidence of cannabis and mushrooms. And if you've read the Sacred Drugs of Buddhism by Mike Crowley addresses the potential mushroom presence in Buddhism. So Mike Crowley, postulates that the Buddha was a metaphor from a mushroom of sorts. Now, you really need to read all of that to get it, but it's really good. And so, yes. If you're well versed in Hinduism or Buddhism, then I would highly recommend it. Now, there are some interesting links that Mr. Crowley makes. I have a hard time saying that. Thanks, Ozzy. Mike Crowley talks about how mushrooms linguistically are not evident in I'm thinking the wrong language. I'm thinking love language. Come on. It's not. Yes. Anyway, okay. What is the biggest, the biggest language? Thank you. Like, come on, it's the biggest language ever. They've got a word. Sanskrit has a word for everything. Literally everything. Except mushroom. They have a word for everything more so than Greeks. So they don't have a word for mushroom, though. However, there was a law that made illegal psychoactive mushrooms for a certain point. I do not have the timeline written down, of course, because I forgot that book before I typed up my slides. So there is no word for mushroom. However, everything used to talk about it is described. When you are talking about a mushroom, you would just say the stalk or stem, and you would describe the umbrella or cap, and it could have a bump on the head, so to speak, like psilocybin kabinzis do. And there's just a lot of correlation between the linguistic evidence or lack thereof and the presence of psychoactive mushrooms that were quite some time ago made illegal in those parts. So it stands to reason that that information in that region was intentionally esotericized to a point to make people forget, not necessarily like just to keep it in a smaller group, but actually try and get it out of human thought, because they did not want to teach that information to their friends and loved ones. They did not want that to go on. Next slide, please. We'll just go on from there. Now, the Americas. Central and South American cultures have built statues, idols, and entire temple complexes and even cities, venerating hallucinogenic plant gods. Now, stone carvings in which humanoid figures are depicted under the cap of a mushroom have been dated to approximately 1000 to 500 BCE. And the evidence for the use of entheogenic or inebriating plants and mushrooms dates back as early as 10,000 BCE. We see evidence for DMT in the form of snuffs, smokes, toads, ayahuasca, LSA, alkaloids like Aliuqui and morning glory, or in nicotine, coca, datura, and psilocybin. Needless to say, the cultures that have lived in pre-Columbian Americas have had one of the most sophisticated and highly advanced developed pharmacopoeias ever collected in the span of human history. Now, quote, "The first thing to be eaten at the feast were small black mushrooms that they called nanakatl? I don't know if I'm probably butchering that horribly. And they bring on drunkenness, hallucinations, and even lechery. They ate these before the dawn with honey, and when they began to feel the effects, they began to dance, and some sang, others wept. When the drunkenness of the mushrooms had passed, they spoke with one another of the visions that they had seen." That was a quote from Bernardino de Sahagún of the Florentine Codex. The cultures in pre-Columbian Americas did not seem to have many social taboos regarding plant medicines and intoxicants or entheogenic agents. And while there were examples of a few tribes that did have such taboos, especially regarding points of intoxication, if you will, they all universally used plants and fungi as medicines and vehicles to alter states of consciousness, even if they didn't use them in an inebriation form. The Aztecs, who held what was perhaps one of the most well-documented and explored encyclopedias of hallucinogenic plants the world has ever seen, were the culmination of three major societies over 12,000 years who developed their knowledge of herb lore into not only science, but an art form. Excuse me. This is the second to last one. All right. Now, the Aztec god, Xochipilli, Prince of Flowers, was the divine patron of the flowery dream or ritual-like trance. Like Dionysus in Greece, he was believed to actually be the plant itself, and to ingest his sacred plant was to be possessed or overcome by his spirit, which caused the intoxication and sometimes paranormal or psi phenomena. He is depicted as having his head thrown back in ecstasy, eyes and nose running from the expectorant side effects of these compounds, and along with symbols for several easily identifiable hallucinogenic plants endemic to the regions. You can see different shapes of flowers and stuff. North American tribal communities also used a wide variety of psychotropic and hallucinogenic plants and fungi for ceremonial and initiatory purposes. The Algonquin tribes of the East Coast were reported to use datura, amanita, ephedra, and more as late as the early 20th century. Next slide, please. Now, the beginning of the 12th century, an archaic revival of sorts began to take hold of Western Europe, Kabbalah and Hermetic philosophy presented itself in the form of alchemy, which is was a proto-science that made major headway in the fields of medicine, mathematics, chemistry, and aided in the construction of Cartesian philosophy as we know it today. The main pursuit of the alchemists was the philosopher's stone, the prima materia, or the elixir of life, terms that were sometimes used synonymous for the same mercurial and seemingly impossible item. There were a great many characters and conmen working to fool rich and gullible people into believing that alchemists could in fact physically turn lead into gold. And as such, alchemy gained a poor reputation. Eventually, it all but died out in the mid-19th century, and it wasn't until the work of Carl Jung that the philosopher's stone was popularly accepted again as being a philosophical or spiritual pursuit, and representing the transmutation of the lesser metals, the acolyte, into higher, more noble ones, or the master. Now, the idea being that true alchemists were conducting physical experiments. The idea being that true alchemists, while conducting physical experiments in the lab, were also conducting some rather sophisticated thought experiments. The experiment was literally right above one another, and I skipped a minute, sorry. Jung suggested that many of the great alchemists in Europe were just some of the first psychoanalysts. And when one reads the descriptions left of the philosopher's stone and explores the more physical laboratories operated by great alchemists, it is apparent that at least a few of its practitioners interpreted the stone or the prima materia to be a hallucinogenic mushroom. The stone is described as being carried in the belly of the wind, able to replicate itself from any part of itself, as being made of growing on philosophical dung, as well as descriptions of it being a vegetable. And you can find this in Entheogens by Michael Muir. Another quote. The alchemists have said that the fruit of their tree strives up to the heaven because out of the philosophical earth there arises a certain substance like unto the branches of a loathsome sponge. The point about which the whole art turns lies in the living things of nature. From a likeness not altogether removed, that they called this material virgin's milk and blessed rose-colored blood. For in the blood of this stone is hidden its soul. That was Ashmole Elias Theatrium Chemicum Britannicum, London, 1658. Again, I'm not suggesting that this was some grand conspiracy among esoteric groups of medieval Europe, or that the mushroom was in any kind the answer to any one question. I'm just saying that we can point to at least a few prominent alchemists who were clearly using entheogenic materials as an aid to their practical and philosophical pursuits. Paracelsus once stated, quote, "I have made a great discovery," he said. "The center of my alchemical opus lies in the magic of laudanum," end quote. And that was on his Hermetic and Alchemical Writings of Paracelsus the Great. Now, when we look at this, we see, real quick, back to right here. So we're talking about the prima materia potentially being a hallucinogenic mushroom. And if you check out this slide right here, this plate shows so much esoteric mushroom iconography, it's ridiculous. Everybody here, I assume, has heard of Paul Stamets. He wrote a little book that talks about some mushroom stuff. Like, everything about mushrooms, how to grow them and all of that. And if you look in his cultivation styles, you will find a technique that often looks a lot like this, and I'm not even going to get into the one-legged man hopping around and talk about shade foots or anything like that. But if one were to inoculate their orchard, for example, because you want to increase your biodiversity and use mycoremediation to make better crops or whatever, this is a way that you would do it. You would inoculate your trees like this. And then I don't know if you can see little pointy top figures and then round ones as well that are different, which potentially could be truffle to mushroom. And we do know that there are hallucinogenic truffles as well. Now, when we look at this, we see a clear chain of evidence reaching from the Paleolithic all the way to modernity, that this universal ceremony of ingesting a holy or divine material and subsequent visions or communications with otherworldly beings is just an unambiguous reference to what we today would call an entheogenic experience. This archetype, generally referred to as sacrament, is a distinct role in virtually every major religion and simply an archaic survival of the entheogenic rite of humanity. If we don't approach this subject from a multidisciplinary background, this symbolism is easily missed and could be overlooked by mainstream culture for another 2,000 years. And we don't need this to become another baby-eating mystery. So all I'm calling for is a well-rounded interdisciplinary approach to that. So thank you for listening to me talk about entheogens in the Eucharist and how altered states are the origin of sacrament.
If you could just elaborate more on the, I guess it's because I personally view the rites of Eleusis as a very strong feminist message.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious why you don't.
No, I think it is, but I don't
Oh, then
think
maybe
it's
I
about.
misunderstood.
I was just saying that the whole fact that Demeter did not get what she wanted. Persephone did not get what she wanted. They both had to kowtow and make a compromise, which is why we have the winter. And Demeter just stood her ground. But it seems like overall it wasn't as much of a win as I would like. I feel like the story was, maybe it was a win because there were so few feminist wins at the time. But to have it,
that's an understatement, but yeah.
But to have it be forged out of direct oppression, wife stealing,
Yes,
kidnapping,
yes,
and that kind of thing, and then to have a male god go and be like, well, we don't want to kill off all the people that are praising us. We don't want to kill off all our worshipers. So let's give her daughter for a little bit of time, and then we can live with a dead season as long as we don't have a dead year, right? So I feel like it was I feel like she was placated more than actually got any kind of win.
Sure. Yeah,
And then it was misinterpreted by outsiders for so long in such an anti-feminist way that...
Not the Christians.
No. They don't do anything crazy. But so that's why I don't know. I don't feel like it was a full win.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Just curious.
But I mean, we don't have to fight for our vote right now. So that was a win then. It may not have been as much of a win as we thought looking back on it, because now we can see that equity is not necessarily
It's getting somewhat better.
yeah, it is. It's getting better.
Cool.
For sure. Anyway.
One quick question.
Yeah.
How do you say it was the drinking cannabis that she got drunk? It says bomb.
Bong.
How do you spell it? It's not like
Bang. I don't remember if there's an E. I don't think there's an E.
Sometimes-
It's Bhanglasse.
And sometimes there's a UE at the end. Sometimes
Oh,
it's
it
B.
is the-
Yeah, yes, every now and then. But your
Okay.
BHANG is
Okay.
is the or sometimes BHANG.
And you think that the bong is comes from here, the word
Just
bong?
the sound.
It could be.
Yeah.
Just that
No,
sound.
just-
Okay.
Okay, so up next we have Thomas Hatsis, who's a historian of ancient and medieval witchcraft, Western spirituality, and psychedelic plants. In 2017, 2 of his books found homes in the Smithsonian Museum, Roller Derby, The Sensation That Caused a Book, and the Terence McKenna collection at Occidental College, The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic. And I know Tom has some copies over there for sale, so feel free to pick one up.
How much?
His
$20.
His forthcoming book, Psychedelic Mysteries, Spirit Plants, Western Civilization, and the Inexpressible Fire, comes out next September from Inner Traditions, Park Street Press. He is currently a contender for the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest magical ritual ever performed in the United States. When not writing books and studying occultism, Hatsis enjoys mixing magic potions and playing roller derby. So let's welcome Tom.
Thank you. One of the things I do need to say real quick, the books do come with a joke, so you do get a joke with that. Giselle it is?
Yes.
Giselle, yes, you get a joke with that later.
Oh, okay.
So, cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. Really, this is so awesome, especially, what is it, Oscar night? And you guys came out anyway? That's so awesome. Thank you so much to my buddy and travel partner Amanda for just dealing with me on the road for one, and being a great babysitter when I take too much cannabis food, and giving a great presentation tonight. Seriously, that was awesome. Thank you. Demonizing the entheogenic sacred feminine. We're actually going to keep the story of psychedelic feminism going a little bit longer into the night because I know Amanda agrees with me, but I'm sure many of you do as well. This is a story that really needs to be told already because it is so important to our development as humans, like just going into the future. For far too long, we have ignored the talents of half the goddamn population of this planet. More than half. But the point is, yes, true. That's got to stop. And we're hoping to bring these ideas, into our present time to show what has actually happened with all of this. Because there is a really deep tradition of psychedelic feminism, and while Amanda talked about some of it, I'm going to get real dirty with it tonight. So, I'm sure many of you have heard of the flying ointment or the witch's ointment. Is anyone not familiar with that term? Amanda. You're not familiar with that? Okay, so a flying ointment is a generic term for what is referred to today as a psychedelic experience among wise women living in medieval times. They would call it a flying ointment, like we would call it astral projection. Now, the witch's ointment is a theological stereotype of this women's entheogenic religion. I'm going to get into all of that. So when I first started looking for this witch's ointment, this is back in 2005 when I started my research. When I went looking for it, I was looking just for that actually, this generic flying ointment experience. There are a few things in books here, a few things on the internet that would talk about this stuff, but I kept reading them over and over, and I noticed something about them. They were all just citing themselves and each other. And nobody was talking about anything that was actually going on in these medieval times. So I decided I'm going to go looking into these records to see what is the truth about this flying ointment. And when I did, like seriously, holy shit, there are so many magical uses for psychedelics in the ancient and medieval world. I literally, in my forthcoming book, had to invent all these neologisms just to talk about them. Pretty much for every single kind of magic performed in medieval times. If you knew about the power of a psychedelic plant, they didn't call it psychedelics, but for ease I'll refer to them as such. If you knew about this, you might just add it to your, you absolutely did, and we have very, very obvious records of this. You would absolutely add them to your magic. Such things like prophecy. We had this, there was a lady living in Styria named Legio fra Helmben. And this was a little odd for a wise woman. Normally, if somebody went to a wise woman asking for lost or stolen property, it was the wise woman who would take some kind of psychedelic to enter a trance, much like Amanda brought up Maria Sabina doing. In this particular case, though, this wise woman gave it, and we actually know what she was using, henbane, to her clients to have their own kind of trip to find their lost objects. A trial I looked at, or a case I looked at, it was like some guy looking for his lost ox. So she gave him some henbane and said, yeah, eat this and you'll have a vision of where your ox is. Other things like medical magic, people use, just like in all cultures we talk about, and Amanda talked about, these different shamanistic practices. These wise women, and I'm using wise women here as a very generic term, because these women were actually specialists in different fields, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Now, to understand, however, how these, excuse me, sorry, let me back up a second. Other things they use this magic for, when I first went looking into this research, excuse me, they use these psychedelics for, I was looking for just one kind of flying ointment. That was just the psychedelic or entheogenic ointment. But when I got deeper into the records, I discovered that there were entheogenic ointments that had nothing to do with spirit flight. There were flying ointments that had nothing to do with entheogenic experiences. And there were entheogenic flying ointments, which is what I believe theologians based the witch's ointment off of. Sorry. In order to understand how this happened, how these entheogenic ointments, again, they did not use the word entheogen, but that's what we would call them today. In order to understand how these entheogenic ointments became bastardized as these demonic ointments, I have to go over two trends in ecclesiastical literary history, or everything I'm going to say tonight will not make any sense at all. The witch's ointment formed in the writing of ecclesiastical writers, and we are not going to actually understand it unless we look at what they had to say about it, and not only that, but how they changed its meaning over time. The first of these trends, ecclesiastical literary trends, is called the interpretatio romana. That's what scholars call it. It just means it was this way for theologians during the 1400s, 1300s, around that time, to reimagine folk beliefs in ways that made sense in the ancient world. It was the Roman interpretation. The second trend is called the stereotypical, or the formulation of the stereotypical witch. So I'm going to go over both of those in turn. Slide! So, this is what the interpretatio romana looks like. All over Western Europe and Eastern Europe, you have these different folk beliefs that are reimagined with this clerical gloss. So you have these different kinds of night goers. Okay, there are these different kinds of, they were called the good society sometimes, the benesocia. They would go from city to city and town to town, from house to house, and they would ransack houses that were a little bit messy, and they would bless houses that were well kept. We today actually have a cultural holdover from this. If you were ever younger and your parents told you to clean your room, or if you're a parent and you've ever yelled at your kid to clean your room, believe it or not, this is actually residue from a time in our history when it was believed that if your house was messy, spirits would destroy it. And if it was clean, they would bless it. Anyway, these spirits were reimagined by theologians, depending on the author. Sometimes they're witches disguised as demons, other times demons disguised as witches. Other folk beliefs like the Silwan, these are forest nymphs or creatures like fairies, elves, kobolds, pixies, me, that kind of shit. Okay, they were reimagined as incubi and succubi. Now, incubi, or incubus in the singular, is not just the name of a band that used to be good and now sucks. It's also the name of this hypersexual demon that would sneak into your house and defile you in your sleep. The succubus being the female counterpart. Different kinds of medical spirits. Before I mentioned that a lot of these psychedelics, these psychoactives, found their way into medicine. a lot of these wise women would call upon these medical spirits to aid in the operation. In fact, again, to go back to Maria Sabina that Amanda brought up, she called the mushrooms her little helpers. They were the mushroom spirits that would help her. This is a Western analog for the same kind of concept. Now, most importantly, for our purposes tonight, fertility goddess worship of all kinds was reimagined as worship of the ancient huntress goddess Diana. Diana. Now, the reason this is so important is this. This fertility goddess religion was the most difficult pagan belief to eradicate in the burgeoning Christian Europe. Fertility goddess worship I find particularly interesting because it's both monotheistic and polytheistic at the same time. It's monotheistic in that we are talking about the same archetypical great mother worshipped from the days of old in ancient Greece and Rome, certain like, for example, Gaia or at times Demeter that Amanda brought up. We know that this belief was so widespread due to the various names, the multitude of names that this goddess went by, as just a few of many examples. In Italy alone, in Milano, she was known as Madame Oriente. But head out to the Wasser Valley, she's known as Ricella. If you go down south, she's Epiphania. Hop over to Germany, if you're actually in central Germany, she's Bertha, Perkta. Different names are Hera at times. Southern Germany, she's Frau Holt, Frau Helt, Hulda, different all names. In France, Satya, Damino Abundia. In Ireland, the Matria, you get the point. This goddess was worshipped all over Europe. And where it fits into this, the Interpretatio Romana, as I said before, she served as a linguistic placeholder. Why? Well, because different authors, because she went by so many names, they chose just one to call it this. So let's say Antonio is writing in Italy to Wolfgang in Germany. He knows that Wolfgang has never heard of Madame Oriente. He's heard of the local names in Germany. So he's just going to write Diana because at the time Latin was the lingua franca of all of Europe. All educated people could read and write in Latin. So they just used Diana. Now what this looks like in text, we see with swings. No, shit, a merry-go-round. Slide. Okay. A guy named Regino of Prum in 906 of the Common Era was tasked with writing all of these different folk beliefs in the German backwoods, and he writes it in this list. And one should not ignore those certain wicked women who, seduced by the fantastic illusions of demons, believe that they ride at night with certain beasts alongside the pagan goddess Diana. Now this is in the backwoods of Germany. How many people living in the backwoods of Germany had worshipped or even heard of Diana? Zero. None of them had. But this was far easier than saying they ride at night with certain beasts alongside the pagan goddess who goes by many names such as Bertha, Perkta, Hera, Frau Holt, Frau Helt. You could just say all of that by putting Diana. So this is important because when we see the term Diana in medieval records, especially of Christian theologians, it means that they are talking about a fertility goddess worshiper. Yes, awesome. So that is our Interpretatio Romana. It is our first trend in ecclesiastical history, which leads to our second, the stereotypical witch. The stereotypical witch is usually a woman, although sometimes a man, but women actually, absolutely, I should say, took the fucking shit end of this stick in history. So I'm going to move forward with pronouns moving forward. So the stereotypical witch is usually a woman. She flies through the air on an ointment-covered broom. And where does she fly to? The Sabbat, which is this demonic congregation overseen by the devil who has a thing for glow sticks. He was a raver in his day. Yeah, this is the 90s. The 1190s. Anyway, once the stereotypical witch gets to the Sabbath, she will renounce Christianity. This is done by having a large wooden cross put before her feet, and she'll stamp on it and piss on it and shit on it, and she's no longer a Christian. But she will not just renounce Christianity, she will also sell her soul to the devil. While at the Sabbath, she will also learn maleficia, which is evil or harmful magic. Such things like making crops wither, making men impotent, making women miscarry. Anything an agrarian society would really feel anxious about, maleficia was magic that worked against it. The stereotypical witch was also a cannibal. She would sit down to a feast of murdered children and drink chalices overflowing with their blood. Finally, she would have sex with demons. Now, this is a stereotype. Nobody was actually ever doing this. This is just what theologians did so that they could shit on wise women. It is our stereotypical witch, a woman who flies through the air on an ointment-covered broom to renounce Christianity, worship the devil, learn magic, drink blood, and fornicate with demons, otherwise known as my birthday party every year. So, slide. How did this happen? How did we go from this, a woman having a private entheogenic experience, to this? The belief by Christian theologians that these individuals in their own homes were meeting together to meet the devil collectively and worship the devil in this big conspiracy to overthrow humanity. How did it happen that by the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum slide in 14, some historian I am, that's actually should say 1484. So I'm gonna go like this. Sorry about that. Wow, that's pretty bad. You all should fire me for that one. Anyway, the Malleus Maleficarum, meaning the hammer of the witches, actually gave a recipe for this ointment that witches would either anoint on brooms or themselves, or sometimes stoves or chairs to fly to the Sabbath. They would say that it was made out of the flesh and blood of murdered children. Now, that's obviously ridiculous. People were not making psychedelic ointments out of blood, or I would have a lot of cuts on my arms. So, in order to understand how all this happened, again, I know there's a lot of backstory here, and I apologize for it. I promise I'm getting to the psychedelics. In order to understand how this happened, we actually have to go very far back in time, but not to the 1400s, not to the 10th century with the canon episcopacy, but all the way back to before the Common Era, really, before there was even a such thing as Christianity, with what I'm going to call for ease, the insurgents stereotype. The insurgent stereotype was a way of demonizing, essentially, terrorists in the ancient world. These were very common things said about those people trying to overthrow the state. And you could they all read very similarly. The one I chose is from a guy named Diodorus of Sicily, and it's as good as any, if I could get a slide. And he writes, Apollodorus aimed at tyranny, and to render this conspiracy secure, invited a young lad, one of his friends, to a sacrifice, slew him as an offering to the gods, and gave his fellow conspirators the vitals of this young man to eat. And then he mixed the blood of the young man into wine and bade them to drink it. So this was said about every Persian invader, every minor insurgent, every Greek asshole that tried to overthrow the state. These are the things that were said about them. This was also said about that newest group of terrorists to appear in Rome in the 1st century that we today commonly call Christians. Menicius Felix, himself a Christian, records these slanders said by pagans, slide, when he writes, as for the initiation of new members, the details are as disgusting as they are well known. Well known. He's talking about the stereotype, the stuff that was said about these kinds of people. The novice, stabs a child to death. Then the sectarians hungrily drink the child's blood and compete with another as they divide his limbs. Through this victim, they are bound together, and the fact that they all share the knowledge of the crime pledges them to silence. This is obviously that insurgent stereotype that pagan threw on pagan, now being thrown on Christians. But what happened was, as we all know, Christians eventually came to power, and they decided they were going to throw these same stereotypes onto other Christian groups that they found to be heretical. So I call this the heretics stereotype. And Christians got very creative with this. They see here, we don't have where this child comes from. When the Orthodox Christians finally got together to throw this stereotype onto heretical groups, they had a very creative idea as to where that child came from. And they also determined that because they were Christians, these people had all gathered to meet the devil. So what that looks like, we can see as a, what was his name? Michael Sellos casts an aspersion against this group in Bulgaria called the Bogomil, and he writes this, slide please. When the orgy is complete, each member of the Bogomil goes home, and after waiting 9 months, the time when the child of such unnatural seed is born, they come together at the same place. They tear the miserable babies from their mother's arms. They cut their tender flesh all over with sharp knives and catch the dripping blood in basins. They throw the baby still breathing and gasping for life onto the fire to be burned to ashes, after which they mix the ashes with the blood in the bases and thus make an abominable beverage with which they secretly pollute their food and drink. This is now this ages-old stereotype being thrown onto heretics. But something, what? No good?
No, it's great.
Should I shut up?
No, it's great.
Okay, great. Cool.
I was giggling with glee a little too much.
Yes! Cool. So, what happens is, being a wise woman and having these kinds of fertility goddess ideas, salute, starts to be seen, viewed as a heresy. So while wise women were first brought to secular courts if tried for magic, they could now be brought into inquest and tortured, because this was now a heresy, not a secular crime. The text that shows this happening, I think the earliest, is known as the Errores Gazzari, which translated means the errors of the Cathars. If anyone here is familiar with the Cathar heretics? Cool. Yes, the Cathars, it was just a heretical group that flourished in Albi in southern France that were annihilated during the Albigensian Crusade during the 1200s. So they were completely, just, rubbed out, totally. So what happens in the 1400s, that we have a text called the Errores Gazzari, the errors of the Cathars. What are they doing? Well, when we see what it says, the wretched person who has been led astray worships the presiding devil. See, now the devil is coming into this. The devil gives the newest heretic an ointment and a stick so as to return to the Sabbath. The ointment is made by secret method of diabolical malice from the flesh of roasted children, along with other things. Other things. So I want to know what those other things were. And what's interesting about this, I should say, Gazzari, because there were no more Cathars by the 1400s, 1437, when this was published by an anonymous author, although some people think it was the French Inquisitor General named Ponce Fougeron, but we don't actually know. Gazzari, Cathar, was not referring to the heretics of southern France that were killed off in the 1200s. As it turns out, Cathar, Gazar, was a slander term for a wise woman in those days. So while this does say the errors of the Cathars, it could also read the heresy of the witches. Slide. Thank you, please. So, by 1486, we have the Malleus Maleficarum that says that this ointment is made out of the flesh and blood of children, right? Now, that's obviously after the crystallization of the witch stereotype, which took place mostly in the 1430s, right? And way after the Interpretatio Romana as well. Okay. They clearly were borrowing from the Errores Gazzari. But by the time we get here, they don't even say that other things, in Latin, alikos, ali, other things, they don't even say that they were there. They just say that it's the flesh and blood of children, right? But the Arones Gazari does allude to other things being in this ointment. So I want to know, well, what were these other things in that ointment? What exactly were they trying to cover up, and why were they anxious to mention them in the first place? And so what I'm now going to do, finally, because you've all been very patient, is not do that, but show this is actually the earliest depiction I could find real quick from a guy named Johann Tincturus, because in the 1400s everybody was named Johann. And what you actually have, no, seriously, they were. Everybody. What you have here these are French heretics called Waldensians that were way to bastardized as the Vaudry. Okay? Now, Vaudry also included the actions of wise women who we see up here on brooms and being carried by demons. So what's going on? This is the earliest depiction from around 1460 of this fertility religion of the wise women being placed besides heretical Christian groups. It's also the earliest depiction I could find of Baphomet, Satan as the goat. So, now slide, sorry. So now this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk going over, because it's probably what you all showed up for, is how these entheogenic flying ointments were fed through the literary machinery of the Interpretatio Romana and spit out the other end of history as that newest addition to the stereotypical witch, the stereotypical witch's ointment. I'm going to go over 4 accounts real quick that show, in my opinion, beyond a shadow of a doubt, how this happened. And they're by 2 different authors. One wrote 2 of them, the other wrote the other 2. And the first guy is this guy, Johann Nitter. Johann Nitter was a professor of theology at the University of Vienna. He was also very interested in dealing with heretics, but he was not a heretic hunter. He was actually a heretic negotiator. He was a very reasonable person for his time and place, and actually quite progressive in his thinking, though still limited by his time, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. But he never tried or hunted a single witch or heretic. He wasn't into that. And this book he's holding here, this is called the Pharmacopoeia, which means the anthill. Sometimes today we'll hear songs or politicians, they'll refer to people or like an anthill. We're all familiar with that analogy. He was doing that like centuries ago, this guy. The thing that I just want to say about him and why I think it's very important, we tend to paint all these churchmen with a very broad brush. In this book, Pharmacopoeia, there's a chapter in there that discusses the superiority of the female gender, believe it or not. There's another chapter in there that goes over folk magic and folk beliefs that he had no problem with whatsoever, and was essentially saying to other priests, hey, just leave these people alone. They're not harming anybody. Just get the fuck out of here already. They're not doing anything, okay? But he obviously did have his biases being born at that time. I got to say one last thing real quick. I just have to geek out on this because it's just a history thing. Sorry, this is not actually part of the talk, but I find this really cool. That's actually what he looked like. Now, that might not seem that impressive, but in the 1400s, regular people did not have likenesses made of them at all. Most rich people didn't even have likenesses made of them. But that's actually what he looked like. And I just think that's so cool, because so many times you're reading these guys, but you always wonder what these people actually look like. But that's actually what he did look like. On the History Channel, Discovery Channel, anytime they bring up somebody from the past, they'll flash a picture, right, or a bust or a statue. 9 times out of 10, that's not actually the person they're talking about. But it's TV, it's television, so they have to put something there. But that actually is him. I just think that's so cool. Anyway, before publishing the Pharmacopoeia, he put together a collection of sermons that I'm going to just call Predigten for ease, because that's Old High German for the word sermon. And they were sermons he'd given around the 1420s, 1420s or so. And in one of these sermons, in Predigten, he gives a talk about the first commandment and idolatry. Now, I also want to say something about the word sermon, because sermon is from the Latin sermo, which means report. These were news reports. So when you read sermons from this time, these guys were the newscasters of their day, going to different towns, telling people what was going on in the world around them. Now, of course, they're embellished with, Christian theology, but if you could scrape away at that, you actually do get legitimate folk beliefs of the time. And in the sermon on idolatry, he's not talking about worshiping statues or busts or runes or anything like that. He's actually talking about people when you're sick, seeing wise women, pagan, evil pagan wise women, instead of a gallant Christian doctor. So that's what he's saying is idolatry. Oh, that throbbing in your knee, that pain in your head, yeah, you're still having that because you went to this crazy lady instead of going to a male physician. And in this sermon, he actually writes something so important that pertains to these ointments and their origin that I'd like to share. Slide, please. Let's all read together. No, I'm kidding. This is Old High German, and what it says is, this kind of person is known as an Unholder. Now I'm going to stop myself a second. You remember earlier I was saying in southern Germany, you've been paying attention, you're already shaking your head. Sarah it is? Yes. Thank you, Sarah. So, different kinds of old names. So he's letting us know that this woman, it's plural here, Unholda, but in the singular would be Unholdin. He's letting us know that this is a fertility goddess worshiper. And she causes much trouble, in her communities. However, salbmakend, through the salves that they make, the ointments they make, inwing farent, in this way they travel away. Wait, what? Through the salves that they make, this is how they travel away? Well, where are they going? Well, Nitter tells us they're going to the Huberg. The Huberg was the supernatural mountaintop that people believed you could go to worship the gods of old. Amanda was talking about these feminine religions being stamped out a fuck ton. And sorry, that was loud, but it's true. It really was. It's ridiculous what was done. And what seems to have happened here is that people were now taking that actual collective revelry and having internal experiences with them, so that they couldn't be caught for doing it. And he even tells us that he watched this Unholden perform her magical act that got her to fly to the Huberg. She would take a kneading bowl, a large bowl, and put it on a stool, climb inside the stool, rub her body with an ointment while singing magical words. And Nitter tells us, she was so deluded that instead of flying away, she was knocked out cold and fell over. So strong were the narcotics in her ointment. But the point of all this is that there's no devil here. There's no Sabbath imagery. There's no fornicating with demons or drinking child's blood. It's very clear he's talking about a medical ointment. Well, why is that? Because slide! Pridington was published in 1430. The crystallization of the witch stereotype didn't exist yet. It would be like talking about McDonald's in 1940. It just wasn't there. And it escaped the Interpretatio Romana because Nitter was speaking to a congregation. He wasn't talking to his peers. Had he said Diana or any of the other language of the Interpretatio Romana, it would have gone over his congregation's head. But they knew what an Unholden was, and they certainly knew what the Huberg was. So we're getting a purer form of these ointments. It's for wise women to travel to the Huberg and other places in other countries so that they could worship the goddesses and gods of old, and there would be pans playing pan flutes and satyrs and this bacchanalian revelry and unicorns and all kinds of fun shit. It was a great time. Now, no, it really was. Now, like I said before, though, there was that book that Nitter was holding called the Pharmacopoeia. He actually brings this woman, this Unholden, up again in Pharmacopoeia. The thing is that he wrote Pharmacopoeia for his peers, so it's all in Latin. So he couldn't call the woman an Unholden, and he couldn't call her spiritual destination the Huberg. So in Latin he writes, slide please, she climbed into the bowl and after smearing an ointment on her skin recited magical words. However, under the control of demons, she did not fly with Diana, there she is, but only dreamed of Lady Venus. Wait, what? Under the control of, she did not fly with Diana, but only dreamed of Lady Venus? Well, I should clear something up real quick about this under the control of demons terminology. It was determined at the Council of Paris centuries earlier what constituted being under the control of demons. Salute. One of them was being Jewish. I mean, obviously, not kidding. The other was drugs, putting drugs in food. But this sentence here, in the 10 or so years that I did research for this book, this was the most complicated sentence I came across. And I finally understood it, and I want to share it with you all because it was this breakthrough. She did not fly with Diana, but only dreamed of Lady Venus. What happened was, when I first came across this passage, I had no idea that there was a such thing as the Interpretatio Romana. And I had never heard of that Predicton passage. It's a very obscure passage. I had to dig like a lot to find that. And what you get here is, when you put that lens of the Interpretatio Romana over Predicton, she did not fly with Holda, Diana being the linguistic placeholder for the goddess, but only dreamed of Lady Venus. Lady Venus, as it turns out, was what the educated people called, or rather I should say Venus Mountain was what they called the Huberg. So what you have here is the lens being put over this actual folk belief. And we're getting a little bit further away from what the truth of what was going on with this fertility goddess religion. Now would be a great time for a slide. For Macarius, as you saw, there's still no mention really of the devil. There's no Sabbath imagery. That's because it was published in 1437. The crystallization of the witch stereotype didn't exist yet, but the Interpretatio Romana certainly did. That's why it reads the way it does. What's going to happen here, in 1437, we're going to have a trajectory in history. If people had adopted Nitter's stance, I wouldn't be giving this presentation right now. But instead they adopted the stance of the Aurores Gazari and demonized this feminine religion. Next slide, please. This next man here, Alonso Tostado, I'm going to go over 2 of his accounts as well. He was the Bishop of Avila, Spain. Most importantly, he was a biblical literalist, meaning he took the stories from the Bible to be true. Not true based on faith, but true based on this new emergent thing coming out called natural science. So he would go through these biblical stories trying to find scientific explanations for biblical stories. And he was writing a commentary one night on Genesis. And he gets to that famous passage in Genesis where God, or Yahweh, excuse me, and Danny Newman will yell at me, Yahweh Elohim at the time, how he could pull a rib from Adam to create Eve without causing Adam any pain. So he puts his quill down, he takes a sip of wine or water, or turned water to wine, and he paces and he thinks about it. How could Yahweh Elohim do this? And finally it hits him. A light bulb, but not a light bulb, but a candle goes off over his head. He runs back to his desk, grabs his quill, shoves it into the inkwell, and writes. Some of these ointments are the kinds that doctors use when they want to operate. We know too that this kind of anointing causes such mental disassociation that for a short while a person will become separate from the self and feel no sensation. So that's how Yahweh did it. He used one of those medical arms. I mean, if physicians can do this, God could do it, obviously. Now, that might have been the end of the story had Tostado not... Oh, you're getting ready. I love it. You're getting my raises and my timbre. It's awesome. This would have been the end of the story had Tostado not furnished us one crucial detail about these women. Brad! There are certain women, we theologians call them witches, who admit to using these same medical ointments, along with certain ritual chants to imagine that they are transported wherever they wish, to diverse places where they meet with other women and men. There they enjoy and indulge in food and all sorts of pleasures. There is no getting around it. This is the description of a psychedelic experience in the 1400s. You'll have noticed something about this. Where's Satan? Where are demons? Where's fucking demons? Where's drinking child's blood? He says that they're medical ointments. Where is all the Sabbath imagery in this text? Well, there is none, because it was published in 1435. The witch stereotype did not exist yet. And it escaped the Interpretatio Romana because he was just writing. He wasn't trying to prove these ointments one way or the other. What makes it such a nugget of history is Tostado was not trying to prove that there were women that practiced magic. He was not trying to prove that they had access to what we would call psychedelics. He was not trying to prove that they used what we would call psychedelics to have these experiences. All he was trying to prove was, yeah, Yahweh Elohim could use one of these medical ointments on Adam to pull a rib from him without causing any pain. It wasn't even the point. And that's what makes it just so valuable, invaluable to the historian. It's not colored by anything. We're getting these ointments in a much purer form. But that's all about to change, because Tostado went on to write another commentary, this one on the Gospel of Matthew. And he gets to that famous passage, Matthew, I think it's 4 verses 1 through 11. Don't quote me on that if you're watching at home. But I think it's 4, 1 through 11, where the devil appears to Jesus and tempts him in the desert, right? First, Satan appears and he brings Jesus to the temple, the roof of the temple in Jerusalem, and says, bow down and worship me, and all of this can be yours. Jesus says, no. Devil says, all right. And he brings him to the highest peak in the Jerusalem wilderness. Says, forget just the city. All that you could see can be yours. Jesus says, go fuck yourself. The devil disappears. I'll get him next time. Anyway, no. So this really bothered Alonso Tostado. Could the devil really transport people through the air? And not just anybody, but the Son of God. So he puts his quill down, takes some more wine, has a little more wine, and he thinks about it. And he decides that he is going to rest his argument once again in using medical drugs. And in this commentary he writes, a person who believes in transvection, which is the Latin term for spirit flight, belongs to the devil. They believe Diana is a goddess, and yet Diana is the devil. Interpretatio Romana, feeding right into the witch stereotype. You're watching it happen in print. It should not be denied that female and also male sorcerers with certain kinds of wicked rituals and ointments are carried away by demons. They revere the demons by indulging in lust and all indecencies. Anybody notice a change of tone there from the last one? Can we get the next slide, please? Anybody notice a change of tone? Where's the devil over here? His ass is all over this one. Well, why is that? We'll know with a slide. Because the commentary on Matthew was published in 1440, at exactly the time the Interpretatio Romana was feeding into the crystallization of the witch stereotype. Timeline, commentaries, Matthew, timeline. Ah, cool. Let's get into what this religion was actually like for these wise women. It seems as if to enter the spirit world for them, you could not enter the spirit world as a human. People were barred from the spirit world. This most likely, and I don't know, but I think this goes back to ancient Greece with like the Garden of Medea, for example, the house of Hatsis. Mortals could not enter these sacred places. I think that this is just this is an echo of that, but we don't really know. But the point is they could not enter the spirit world as humans, so they would either enter as zombies or in different animal shapes. And what it looks like, slide please, is something like this. In 1400s, a guy named Hans Whitler wrote the book that's the Book of Virtue. And he talks about this woman turning into a cat, right? Now you look at her, she looks very regular, right? She probably has a butterfly tattoo on her ankle. She likes her pumpkin spice lattes. She's a basic witch. There's nothing really diabolical about her, right? But look at 1489, after the stereotype of the witch. And this is, again, women transformed into animals. But look at their faces. They're diabolical looking. And you have Maleficia, you have Tempestati, which was called destroying crops with storms. Okay, so you have a before the witch stereotype and after what it looked like. Now, let's get into, let's see, was it Piorina de Bripio? was one of these wise women. Now, she was more of a shaman, so now I'm going to get more into their specialties. Piorina was a shaman. She would enter the spirit world to meet with Madame Oriente, who would teach her the virtues of herbs and stones and how to heal her community, which is classic, tools of shamanism. Entering the spirit world to join the community. To heal the community. Now, the shapes that Piorina would turn into, we actually know what they were. One was a zombie, and we know why, because you couldn't be a person, you couldn't be a living person in the spirit world. Another was a fox. We don't know why she turned into a fox, though. There's no record of why that was. The third was a donkey, and as it turns out, it is left in the records why she turned into a donkey. Part of her heresy involved carrying Jesus' cross to be crucified. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it say a donkey helped Jesus carry his cross, but in her folk religion, this was a staple of that religion. So in order for the entire universe to not be cosmically destroyed, she would use her psychedelic to turn herself into a donkey to carry Jesus' cross so that he could be crucified and we all won't die. Wasn't that so nice of her? I think that's very nice. But these are the kinds of odd things and really interesting beliefs of people in those times. That was considered a heresy. Just something that simple. The fact that nowhere in the New Testament does it say a donkey helped Jesus, you could be executed for that. And she was. Isn't that insane? I think so. Let me see what the next slide is. So, I want to very briefly, and I'm almost done, I know this is a lot, and thank you all for dealing with me. I want to show, lastly, a microcosmic version of what this witch stereotype looked like by looking over the trial record of a wise woman living in Italy named Mateuccia de Francesca la Striga de Casa Bianca. She herself was not so much a shaman, but she specialized in love magic. She was, however, some form of fertility goddess worshiper. We don't know much about it because, again, these beliefs were all bastardized. And what's interesting is in her trial record, you could actually watch this condemnation and this bastardization take place. And what I think is very interesting about it is that the conversation shifts as soon as they mention her ointment. They mention her ointment, she talks about it, then there's a break where she's tortured and brought back to inquest and is suddenly saying all kinds of different things that are in line with the satanic stereotype of the witch. Now, what I also think is interesting, her record exists in two areas. There's the folk magic side that's untainted by the stereotype, and then there's the latter half, which is. Now, before, when Knitter and Tostado were talking about the chants that those wise women would say when they were rubbing their bodies with the ointments, we actually have preserved in the record the chant Mateuccia said while applying this ointment, and it appears on the side before she was tortured. In fact, it appears right before she was tortured. And those words were, we can hear them today, "Ointment, ointment, take me to the walnut tree in Benevento, over water, over wind, over all bad weather." The walnut tree in Benevento was the Italian version of the Huberg. It's where folk practitioners of this fertility goddess religion would meet up in spirit to worship, without being bothered. What's also interesting is that she very clearly places the power of the ointment as the vector to get there. In Andy Letcher's book, Shroom, one of the criteria that he has, and I agree with all three of his criteria, for a psychedelic being part of a culture, they have to recognize that it is this thing that's causing it. It can't just be they picked something and had this experience and knew nothing about it. This shows that Mateuccia knew 100% what was going on. But then she gets tortured, as we'll just say this break represents that, and is then brought back to inquest. And now she's saying things like, "O Lucibel, demon of hell, after you were released, you changed your name and had the name of great Lucifer. Come to me." This was probably the name, when it came out of her mouth, the name of a fertility goddess that we don't have anymore. She was tortured to say it was the devil. Our last slide, please. Oh, our second to last slide. Can we go back one? So why was this actually written out, these different things? Now we have the ointment, take me to the walnut tree in Benevetio, and it's very clear that it's the psychedelic ointment that's doing this. But when we get to stuff like the Malleus Maleficarum and the Aurores Gazari, where it says that it's just the flesh and blood of other children and other things in one case, okay, it's very important to understand that they actually left us, you know, a breadcrumb trail as to why and how that happened. A guy named Jean Vincent, now yes, wrote this in his Tractibus, which is in the Latin, sorry, in English, Tract Against Demon Invocation. Poison witches mix drugs into love philters and ointments which disturb people's minds, transform their bodies, and kill. They claim to be transvected far away at night to demonic sabbaths by the influence of these same drugs. The correct deduction, however, is that these feats should not be attributed to the natural powers of the drugs, but rather to the cunning of a demon. The demon is the true operative cause, whereas these drugs are the secondary cause. They are writing them out of the record. So that our now really last slide. Excising the entheogens. In 1430, Johann Nitter writes in Predicton that a narcotic ointment knocked this woman out who believed that she could fly to the Heuberg to worship in private. In 1435, in his commentary on Genesis, Alonso Tosado says absolutely they're using these medical drugs. The same stuff physicians use to put patients under to operate, the same shit Yahweh used on Adam. 1437, the Aurores Gazari says baby flesh and other things. Why the other things? Well, because the devil has no role if these are psychedelic drugs. That's why Jean Vincent said the drugs are the secondary cause, not the primary. 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum, well after the stereotypical witch is firmly in place in popular culture. Baby flesh and blood are all that appear. Then in 1500 to 1650, unfortunately, I should say, the Malleus came just after the invention of the printing press. So this was the line that was sold all across Europe. And because of that, baby flesh and blood as ointments are standardized in demon theory. When you read any demonology text from this time, all flesh, blood, nothing about the narcotics, nothing about medical drugs. In fact, Kramer and Sprenger, who wrote the Malleus, cite as their source Johann Nitter and chose not to write that this woman was clearly under the influence of a narcotic ointment. That is how Christian theologians excised the entheogens from this fertility goddess religion. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to take some questions. Ashley.
How on earth did you find all these texts?
Living in my car for almost 10 years, driving around to different archives, translating them while teaching myself Latin, living in my car.
Wow.
From 2005 to...
In Europe?
What's that?
In Europe?
No, in America. I started off in Europe, going to the Comune de Todi, which is where the records for Matteuccia de Francesco are. And I am very upset because there is actually a woodcut of her. But this was in 2007. I just got a space phone last year. I didn't have a camera, so I didn't get a picture of it. But there actually is a picture of what she looked like. Anybody else?
Wait, that still isn't it. But like,
Oh.
so these texts were
Hundreds
like,
of them. Just
but like,
trying to-
were they original texts?
Yes.
And then where did you just start going through
Yep.
at the random and just
Yeah,
looking?
you just have to look. You just
Wow.
roll up your sleeves and get to work and start digging, and that's it. And that's why it took 10 years.
It's impressive.
Anybody else? Yes.
I
Giselle.
just wanted to say that I kind of flipped through the book. And
During
I
my
saw-
talk?
Well, no, just to give you a compliment that I see that you're talking about a lot of different ointments here and kind of how they were made and what they caused, and I think it's fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
And I know a lot of people that would love to have a copy of this. So
Awesome.
is it available on Amazon
It
too?
is.
Yeah.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble has it. I
I have
have
a lot
a
of-
few here.
Good.
And we still need to get back to Portland.
I have
But,
a lot of friends who are witches, and
Yeah.
I want them to have this. So.
Awesome. I want them to have it too.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. It's
Thank
amazing.
you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it was. It's a labor of love, really. It's just, again, we're both Amanda and I feel very strongly about this, and that these are things that really need to be said, and now more than ever, it's very pertinent that this gets out there.
Just out of curiosity, you said Nieder mentioned the superiority of the female gender. What did he say?
Just that they were all the things that you would imagine that we'd say less prone to violence, obviously, better feelers, better able to be more empathic, able to understand all the things that we know and love about women. This, he represented at a time when, it wasn't cool to say that kind of stuff at all. Like not cool. And he really went out. So did a guy named Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim wrote a treatise, the superiority of the feminine gender over the masculine. This was in the early 1500s and is largely considered the first feminist tract in history. Yeah, and he meant it. There were a lot of people that are very, he's been called out, he was just trying to win the favor of a certain queen, and he wrote, you don't write a book like that for that reason, on top of which Johann Wehr, who lived with him at the time, said he treated his wife like gold, and even after she passed away, women would throw themselves at this guy, and he stayed loyal to his wife. He was every bit a feminist. Yeah.
And how do we know that he actually looked like that depiction of him?
The one from, I forget, I'm so sorry, but when I came across it, there was on the side notes in the text, it had talked about how this was actually what he looked like. I don't remember what edition it's from, though. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's good.
An early one, I would imagine, because it was somebody who knew what he looked like.
Yeah.
What's your new book about?
My new book, cool, thank you for asking, is called Psychedelic Mystery Traditions. It comes out this September, and it's a lot of I go over some of what Amanda spoke about, but I get more into one of the areas where I could get down there, where I have a slight disagreement with other scholars in the psychedelic field, and people I should also say I respect, but guys like Carl Ruck, for example, they tend to make the mystery of the mystery religion, they center it around the entheogen. I don't think that was the case at all. I think that the entheogen fit into and you could see how it fits in a puzzle piece, but it wasn't the mystery. Just like what Amanda was talking about with Eleusis. Yes, they absolutely drank a psychedelic potion, but the mystery wasn't about the psychedelic potion. It was about the regenerative cycle and life and the seasons. So when you could actually do that with a lot of these ancient mysteries. So what I'm doing in this book is going over where I think or how I think the entheogen actually played into the mystery itself, because I don't think anybody has done that yet, has shown where maybe where it fit in. And I also do a chapter on this where I try to tell the story from the wise woman's perspective. In The Witch's Ointment, that book is all about how theologians formed this idea out of what these people were doing. Whereas with this one, I take the story from the ground up and try to show what these women were really doing, and more, kind of like this, how it was changed over time. But yeah, that's it. There's a chapter on, the Dionysian festivals, on rites of Eleusis. I have 3 chapters on the use of psychedelics in Christianity, and you might be surprised, it has absolutely nothing to do with painting mushrooms into, images and things like that. Nothing. Christian authors, believe it or not, wrote openly about their psychedelic experiences. There are certain conspiracy theorists that can only read English, so they say they covered it up. But if you can actually read the text, they didn't cover it up at all. They praised Mandrake. A guy named, just as one example, a guy named Theodoret, living in the 8th century, was the bishop of Syria. He wrote openly that one of his favorite things to do was take opium and read the Bible to find the deeper meaning in the scriptures. So they wrote about this stuff. So anybody tells you that they covered it up with mushrooms and painting doesn't know what they're talking about. Just saying. Anything else?
So
Cool.
Why do you think they demonized it?
What's that?
Why do you think they demonized the ointment?
Sure.
Flesh, and why do you think they did that?
Sure. That's a great question.
Yeah.
In those times, there were only 2 forces in the universe. There was the Christian God and there was the devil. If it wasn't the Christian God, it was automatically defaulted to Satanism. So if you were worshiping Madame Oriente, is that Jesus? No. Oh, Satan. Were you worshiping Satan? Satya? Yeah. Was that Jesus? No. How about Yahweh? No? Okay, that's Satan. It's just everything. It wasn't just, let me also say, it wasn't just this particular religion. It was anything, you know? And also, God forbid, you know, it was a woman-focused religion. We tend, I'll just go into this real quick. I'm sorry, guys. I thank you all for staying this late. Some of us have heard maybe of the horned god, this idea that Margaret Murray came out with, that these women were worshiping a horned god. What she didn't understand was that the witch stereotype was a stereotype. So when she saw the devil and the horned god thing, she just thought that that was like an old, you know, green man thing or whatever. It wasn't, though. Every single record references a female deity specifically and only. They were not worshiping male gods. They were female deities. So if anyone tells you otherwise, just tell them to buy my book. At first tell them they're wrong. And then tell them if they want to know why, they can buy my book. Cool. And did anybody happen to get the memo about the guitar? I don't think so, no. I was going to end with a song, and now I'll end being sad. But you all came, so I'm so glad. No. Okay, thank you guys. Seriously.
Thank you.